Good morning, students. We begin with the chapter which we started, 18th century India, and we were doing case study, the Marathas. Now, yesterday we finished the various regional kingdoms which came to power because of the weak Mughal rulers. There was a province of Punjab under Sikhs, then Rajput, Savai Raja Jai Singh of Amber, Awadh under Sadat Khan, then Bengal under Murshid Quli Khan, after him Shujauddaulah and Alivardi Khan, then Hyderabad under Nizamul Mulk, who was Chinquilich Khan, and he was known as Nizamul Mulk, and it was under him, his successors who belonged to Asaf Jahi dynasty, and they called themselves as Nizam. Then there were Jats. Then talked of rise of Mysore under Hyder Ali, and after him his son Tipu Sultan. Now today we take up the Marathas who were growing in power, and we'll talk about them. The Marathas inhabited the hilly regions of Pune and Konkan in Maharashtra. They were mainly cultivators and soldiers employed in the southern states in various jobs. During the reign of Shah Jahan, some groups of Marathas they were involved in looting the areas of Bijapur. So basically, these Marathas they belonged to the region near and around Pune and Konkan, and they were in the Maharashtra state presently. They occupied the southern part. Now, during the rule of Shah Jahan, the you remember the Mughal rulers who were ruling during his reign. The Marathas were only indulging themselves into looting the areas in and around Bijapur. The Marathas were brave and sturdy warriors. They were inspired by the Bhakti literature of Marathi and the military training instilled in them the feeling of nationalism. Now, since they were well equipped with the art of military fighting and training was given to them, so they were filled with nationalism. They were full of nation's fervor. Now, under the leadership of Shivaji, they grew in power. Now, let us go through the factors which contributed to the rise of Maratha power. Now, the rise of the Marathas to power is attributed to the illustrious leadership provided to them by Chhatrapati Shivaji in the second half of the 17th century. Their rise was actually made possible by the peculiar geocultural environment of the Deccan. The tough geographical environment developed in the Marathas the exceptional qualities of self reliance, courage, perseverance, and above all, pride in the dignity of man as man. The broken hill ranges afforded them natural protection against the enemies. Besides, Maratha women added to the strength and patriotism of the men. So here they talk of the basic instinct of the Marathas. They were brave, they were loyal, they were full of nationalism, they had self-reliance, they were courageous, and had a lot of patience and perseverance. Apart from that, the geological factors also helped. That means the geography of the place also helped them. It was a Deccan area, and the mountains were not very high, they were broken, and so they used to hide behind them and fight and take their enemies by surprise. Now, this technique of war is called guerrilla warfare, where you hide in a hiding and you come out in front of your enemy all of a sudden and take them by surprise and hurt them, and you are victorious. So, this is called guerrilla warfare. And it was all done under the leadership. Thank you so much for sending your emojis. Thank you. So it was all under the able leadership of Shivaji Maharaj, and he was popularly known as Chhatrapati Shivaji. Shivaji was born in 1627 AD. Please remember his date. Underline. He was the son of Shahji Bhosle, a petty jagirdar in the Bijapur estate. So he was the son of a jagirdar who was who was working in the state of Bijapur, and his father's name was Shahji Bhosle. Now he received military training from Dadaji Kondev. That means his grandfather Kondev gave him the training. His mother Jijabai was a pious lady, underline Jijabai, the name of her mother. She was a very God fearing lady. She narrated many stories of bravery from the epics and the Purans and instilled patriotism in him. So, now inspired by the young, brave stories told by the mother, Shivaji was brought up with the spirit of nationalism in him. Shivaji organized the Maratha hill tribes into a military force. Now, all the people living in those hilly areas in and around Pune and Konkan, they were organized into one military entity. Okay, and this was done under the leadership of Shivaji. He organized all the Maratha people. He had an ambition to establish a Hindu power in India. The state of Bijapur had almost declined. That means Bijapur was also in a very poor state at that time with no able ruler to govern it. Shivaji captured many forts, including the forts of Toran and Purandhar. Please underline the names of these two forts, Toran and Purandhar. His rising power made him an enemy of Bijapur state and the Mughal viceroy of Deccan. Now, since he was rising in his power, it was not liked by Bijapur, who had no able king under him or no able leadership to control. And on top of it, right at this time, Mughals were also ruling. There were Mughals, and as you can see, Shah Jahan was ruling at the time when Shivaji was in power. So Shah Jahan was an able king. It was only after Aurangzeb that the Mughal dynasty came to an end and declined. So during it is at that time in Delhi, it was Shah Jahan who was ruling, and he was the emperor of India. Rather, he was the Sultan. He was the king of Delhi, Mughal emperor. He was. At the same time, in the north, sorry, in the south, it was Shivaji who was gaining power, who was conquering one territory after another, and so he had given a threat to Bijapur. Now, there ensued a series of long and protracted battles. Now, since Shivaji was gaining power, so he had to confront many battles. Shivaji killed Afzal Khan, the general of the Sultan of Bijapur. Now, Afzal Khan, he was the general of the Sultan of Bijapur, who was ruling at that time. So, Shivaji, what he did was he killed Afzal Khan. Please underline. Then Aurangzeb, who was now in power, Aurangzeb, the Mughal emperor, sent his uncle Shaista Khan to subdue Shivaji. Now, what Aurangzeb did was he sent his uncle, his name was Shaista Khan, to go and overpower Shivaji. But you know what? Shivaji killed his men, but Shaista Khan was able to escape. So finally, when Shaista Khan went to stop Shivaji, he was almost to be killed when he had to run away and escape for his life. Annoyed at this, Aurangzeb sent Raja Jai Singh of Amber with an aim to subjugate Shivaji. Subjugate means to capture him. So finally, when he saw that Afzal Khan, his general, was killed, the general of Sultan of Bijapur, then Aurangzeb saw that Shaista Khan also failed. He could not do anything. So he was very annoyed. Finally, he sent Raja Jai Singh of Amber to go and capture him. Jai Singh seized the Purandar fort, and after a long resistance, Shivaji had to sign the Treaty of Purandar. Please underline this Treaty of Purandar. Now, what happened was when Raja Jai Singh of Amber, you remember the Rajput king, when he was sent by Aurangzeb to go and capture Shivaji, when he came, he gave a tough fight to Shivaji, and after a pretty long battle, Shivaji surrendered to Raja Jai Singh. Okay, now and Shivaji was made to sign a treaty of Purandar. Now, Jaisingh persuaded Shivaji to visit the court of Aurangzeb, where he was insulted, captured, and imprisoned. Shivaji, by his tact, managed to escape from the prison along with his son Sambhaji. Now, listen very carefully. After this treaty was signed, the Treaty of Purandar, it was signed between Shivaji and Raja Jaisingh of Amber, who was working on behalf of Aurangzeb. So when the treaty was signed, Jaisingh told him that Shivaji was to visit Aurangzeb, the court of Delhi. So then Shivaji visited the court of Delhi, which was under Aurangzeb. There he was captured, he was insulted badly, and he was also made a prisoner. Now Shivaji was captured, he was in prison. So what he did was Shivaji somehow managed to escape from the prison. And do you know how he escaped? There was a big fruit basket kept, and he hid himself in that fruit basket. And when the basket was taken out, he ran away from it. So it was in the fruit basket when he ran off. Okay. So along with his son Sambhaji. Now on returning to his court, Shivaji resumed his activities against the Mughals. So once he escaped, he knew that he had been cheated. So again he started taking up battles against the Mughals. He plundered Surat, underline it. सूरत was plundered. Plundered means उसका सूरत तहस नहस करना, and proclaimed himself emperor. So now Shivaji proclaimed himself the emperor, king. Aurangzeb had to recognize him as an independent ruler. Finally, Aurangzeb could not do anything, and he had to recognize him that yes, he is not under him, he is an independent ruler. Shivaji assumed kingship in the traditional Hindu style and was crowned as Chhatrapati by a grand darbar held at Raigad near Pune in 1674 AD. Please underline the date 1674 AD. It was this time when he was crowned as Chhatrapati Shivaji. He thus laid the foundation of the Maratha state. After this, he captured Jinji and Vellore and some parts of Mysore. He died in 1680 AD. So you all can see that finally he died in 1680. You need to remember his date of death. Before dying, he had also captured these places, underline them, Jinji and Vellore. Now we talk of administration of Shivaji. What kind of administration he had? Was he an able ruler? Was his kingdom all in all? Let us see that. Shivaji himself controlled the administration of the state. He had a council of 8 members called the Ashtapradhan Mandal. Please underline this. 8 ministers, underline 8 ministers, council of 8 ministers, underline Ashtapradhan Mandal. That means there were 8 people, and in Hindi it is called Ashtha, 8. है ना, तो अष्ट and pradhan, that means the main people, council, mandal, that means the ministers. So the peshwa, that is the prime minister, the senapati, that is the commander in chief, and the pandit rao, that is the minister in charge of religious matters, were the most important ministers in his council of 8 ministers, which he talked of, ashtapradhan. So we all now come to know that peshwas were the prime ministers, senapati, the commander in chief, and pandit, that means the one who looked into the religious matters. They were the most important post holders among all the other 8. Most of the ministers participated in military campaigns. Whichever military campaign took place, nearly all of the ministers took part in it. Shivaji divided his empire into prants. Prants means provinces, just as we have a country divided into states. Just in this time, the states were the provinces. I mean, it was his territory, which was the kingdom, and then the kingdom was divided into provinces or prants, which were further subdivided into parganas and tarafs. So, just as in today's time, we have states divided into towns and cities, and into districts, and then into villages. So, in the same way, They were divided and subdivided into prants, parganas, and tarafs. Now, the village was the smallest administrative unit headed by Patel. So now the village head person was called a Patel, and the village was the smallest unit in a kingdom. Okay, Shivaji introduced a new source of revenue from the territories subjugated by the Marathas. Now, what he did was, whatever territories he had conquered, mind you, the territories which he had conquered, which were not his, okay, which were subjugated means which were taken away by the Marathas. In these territories, the people had to pay two kinds of taxes. वहां पर उन लोगों को जो उन्होंने शिवाजी ने जो मराठास ने अपनी टेरिटरीज अक्वायर की थी देयर दे हैड टू पे टू काइंड ऑफ टैक्सेस व्हाट वर दे चौथ एंड सरदेश मुखी लेट अस सी चौथ is one fourth of the revenue paid by the rulers in return for protection by the Marathas. That means whatever the king's revenue was in that particular area, which they were earlier by ruled by other kings, now under Shivaji. So those kings they had to give one fourth of the revenue. That means if if they earned 100 rupees, so one fourth of 100 is, come on, one fourth of 100 rupees is 25 rupees.
Ma'am, 25.
Yes, 25 rupees. So 25 rupees were to be paid. I'm just telling you the amount in 100 out of 100. Okay. Otherwise, whatever they had the revenue, out of that, one fourth was to be taken. And that is called chauth. Chauth is, in Hindi, chauth is char, है ना? So one fourth. Then the next is Sardes Mukhi, 1/10 of the revenue paid by the rulers in return for protection against the alien forces.
मैंने कितनी अच्छी डीपी लगाई है
प्लीज स्टॉप आपने बहुत अच्छी डीपी लगाई है बट इट इज गेटिंग रिकॉर्डेड प्लीज पुट योर माइक ऑफ okay now sardes mukhi was 1/10 of the revenue which was to be paid to the rulers and in return for protection against alien forces that means if somebody else other than uh, uh, see marathas if they anyone else attacked them, then it was Marathas who will look after. But for that, they were asked to pay 1/10 of their revenue. Okay, that means if it is out of 100, 1/10 of 100 would be 10 rupees. So Sardes Mukhi was a tax which was to be paid so that they get protection from other alien rulers. Chauth was to be paid as a protection from the Marathas. Since they had occupied those areas, so they will look after that area. And in return, they will ask one fourth. So one fourth was taken for protection, that was called Chauth, and Sardes Mukhi, 1/10 was again for protection, but protection from the alien forces. That means anyone outside could come and attack. So just to avoid that, it was Sardes Mukhi which was charged. Shivaji maintained a well-trained and disciplined army with a strong cavalry and infantry. His soldiers received regular cash salaries. He insisted on high moral values among his soldiers. His army was well trained in guerrilla warfare. I told you about guerrilla warfare, you remember? The forts formed a special feature of Shivaji's military administration. There were about 280 forts in his possession. Each hill fort was under a Havaldar who was assisted by a Brahmin, that is Subedar, for civil and revenue administration. So we all should know that he had a well administered army, well disciplined and trained army, where there was a strong cavalry and infantry. The regular salaries were paid to them in cash, and he kept the tactics of guerrilla warfare when he was fighting. There were number of forts built. There were 280 forts in his possession, and on each fort there was one person in charge who was called Havaldar, and he was assisted by a Brahmin who was called a Subedar. After the death of Shivaji in 1680 AD, his elder son Sambhaji ascended the throne, but he and his successors were weak. They could not retain their territories. So Sambhaji, he was not as capable as Shivaji was. So the territories which Shivaji had gained fell easily after his death, and the territories were taken away by the other rulers. Okay, so just quickly coming to the next page and the topmost three lines, and then we'll stop. In the 18th century, power passed into the hands of Brahmin ministers called Peshwas. It was under them that the Marathas became the dominant power in India. So after Shivaji, his son Sambhaji took over, and after Sambhaji, since he was not a very able ruler, the Peshwas or the ministers in the court of uh, these kings, they took over the path, they took over the throne and the power, and then began the Peshwas, and they were also a very dominating class with all in all power in their hands. We stop here for today. In our next class, we will try to